All right, good afternoon. I'm glad they scheduled me after Rachel because I'm also talking about wild pollinators, but in cotton or row crops more specifically. So my name is Isaac Esquivel. I'm the agronomic and forage crop entomologist based out of Quincy. For those of you that don't know me, and I'm going to be talking about beneficial insects in crops and forages. Lean a little heavier on the crop side of things, so apologize in advance. And about natural enemies and wild bees. There we go. So first, we're going to talk about beneficial insects in crops and forages. And beneficial insects are sort of a broad term. You talk to a lot of growers or consultants, things like that. They just refer to them as beneficials. But what exactly are beneficials? I think for us entomologists, we like to call them natural enemies, at least on the insect side of things. And they're generally predators, parasitoids, pathogens in terms of natural enemies. And then I throw pollinators in here. Why is that going this side? Pollinators in here, not as necessarily as a natural enemy, but can be included as a broad beneficial insect. So our natural enemies can be broken down on the insect side into two major groups, predators or parasitoids. So predators, usually generalist species, things like lady beetles, lady beetle larvae, syrphid fly larvae, which those are the hoverfly larvae that some folks were talking about in the previous talks. Lacewing larvae, and mainly bug destroyers. We can go on and on. But they're usually generalists and they're kind of found everywhere. They're really good on aphid pests. They did a lot of work with sugarcane aphid or sorghum aphid down in South Texas. And then our second group is parasitoids. They're also generalists. We have some specialists and some are highly selective. They can focus on a single species or a specific genus of insects. For example, Aphelinus nigritis, it's a specialist on aphids, hence the genus Aphelinus. And it's really good at controlling aphid pests. And then Encarsia formosa is a whitefly specialist, and it's sort of our classic example of a classical successful biological control program. And our non-insect natural enemies are pathogens and nematodes. Pathogens, usually broad host ranges. You can buy some pathogens as a biological control agents. However, they're not really effective on a large scale, so they'd be better for back home gardens, maybe organic farming where you have smaller plot sizes, smaller fields, or where you can use. And one common one is Bovaria bassiana, which if you see, looks kind of like a fluffy white mold on insects. If you even see it in your house. So if you ever see just a dead insect that looks like covered with a white, fluffy, or sometimes green mold, depending on the species, it's most likely Bovaria bassiana. And then another cool one I just threw in here just for fun is cordyceps. So cordyceps fungus, you've heard of the term the zombie fungus, sort of an inspiration for some video games and TV shows, which is really cool. It's a really cool biology. I suggest looking up on YouTube if you're into that stuff to kind of just see what it does to the insects. It's really cool, but I might be a little biased. And then on the nematode side of things, we do have entomopathogenic nematodes, and they're generally limited to our soil-dwelling insects. So things like mole crickets that we have the example here. And again, they're effective, but they're not necessarily feasible to use on a large scale. So it was effective in mole crickets as a biological control agent, which I'm going to talk about in a couple of slides. So it's just a broad overview of what we're talking about in terms of beneficial insects in crops and forages. Now my favorite group. So when Wilhelm asked about who likes wasps, I really love wasps, or generally just the order Hymenoptera in general, which is inclusive of wasps, ants, and bees. We can break that down into three groups, and that 150,000 is probably really underestimated. I don't know where that's a remnant from. One of my presentations, probably from grad school. But we can break them down into three larger groups, which are Symphyta, Aculeata, and Parasitica. We can talk about Symphyta, bee sawflies, horntails, and wood wasps. And these aren't necessarily predators, but they are herbivores. So some of these species are used as biological control agents for weeds or perhaps invasive trees and invasive plants in general. Parasitica is that group of parasitoids, as mentioned in the previous slides. That's where a lot of our biological control agents come out of. And there's a huge range of natural history and biology across the Parasitica or just Hymenoptera in general. And these are just some examples. My kind of favorite chalcid wasps are these little guys. They look like kind of little transformers, little robots when you look at them under the scope. That one's actually big enough to see with the naked eye. And then lastly, we have the Aculeata, which are ants, bees, and stinging wasps. We can even consider ants as a beneficial insect because some of them are predators, maybe fire ants. Fire ants are pests, they're annoying, but they actually do a good job at controlling some insect pests. And they're a pain in cotton, and I'll talk about that potentially, but don't get distracted. Yes, let's move to the next slide. So now let's talk about mole crickets for our forage people in the room, mole crickets and the Lara wasp. So I'm sure we're all familiar with mole crickets. I know Marcelo gets a lot of mole cricket calls, and he forwards them to me. And then I've been getting a lot too. But we have three non-native pest mole crickets in Florida: the tawny, southern, and short-winged mole crickets. And they're major pests in pasture grasses, Bahia, Bermuda, pretty much any grass, our home lawns, turfs. And they dig tunnels and feed on roots in the grass. And you can see the bottom left here is what extensive outbreak or a high population of mole crickets in this past year can be quite devastating if left uncontrolled. Why is that going away? But there is a biological control program that was implemented back in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, and then it sort of just fizzled out after a while, which we won't get into the details. But its main agent that was imported was Lara bicolor, which is a mole cricket hunter, and it's native to South America. It was imported in 1981 for biological control, and it's probably, in addition to a fly and a nematode, but the wasp is probably one of the most successful out of the three, and as far as establishment and spread, because we can see it everywhere from the Panhandle down to South Florida. And they lay eggs on adult mole crickets, and the larvae eat it from the inside out. I have a cool video on the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more there. But the adults, as we talked about in Wilhelm's talk, they use nectar as a sugar source. So the question comes, can we bolster populations with floral resources in pastures? And which ones, if so? Because they also imported a plant. It was false buttonweed. Does that sound correct, Wilhelm? False buttonweed that ended up being an invasive weed, and it ended up causing more problems in pastures than it did providing benefits. So we have to make sure whatever we're going to put in our pastures is not going to spread and become an invasive weed. And I'm thinking, just as Wilhelm's going to be starting his master's, hopefully in the spring or summer, I'm looking at what sort of floral resources we can provide to sort of recruit Lara wasps to pastures. And I think buckwheat's going to be a really good one, because bees love buckwheat, but pretty much a lot of insects love buckwheat. Now here's just a video of a Lara wasp hunting and laying an egg on a poor cricket. And I said they're kind of a broad range. This was outside my house, and outside my condo in Tallahassee. We have a mole cricket problem even in our grass there. You can see it's going to sting the mole cricket, sort of paralyzes it, comes back, lays an egg, walks off. Mole cricket gets up like nothing happened, but the egg will slowly hatch and then be eaten from the inside out, eventually killing the mole cricket. They're really efficient hunters, and each time it lays an egg, it's going to kill that mole cricket. They're really cool to watch. So we can figure out how do we bolster these populations in pastures to give us a little more control of mole crickets, just because we're sort of limited on the insecticide options we have for mole crickets in general. Now I'll talk about a little bit about winter covers to improve beneficial insect recruitment in cotton. This work was done by some folks at UGA. They looked at crimson clover and rye in terms of reducing cotton pests early and late season. So they found that rye covers promoted a greater diversity of natural enemies and abundance in cotton. And you can see on this, the top graph, top figure on the top there. And then that both covers reduce thrips populations in early season cotton, which if it's when thrips are pests. And then rye covers slightly reduce boll injury from stink bugs in the later season cotton. So cover crops sort of had an effect on early and late season pests in cotton. But I'm sort of interested on what are we seeing in Florida? This was done in UGA. And I like to look at things that are at a local region or regional level to see what does rye and clovers work in our systems, which a lot of growers are already using, or potentially what other covers can we use to sort of recruit more beneficial insects that may also recruit pollinators. Now we're going to talk about pollination, or pollination in crops. Rachel had a good introduction in pollination, so it saves me a little time to talk about that. But we can generally categorize crops as being pollinator dependent or pollinator independent. And the pollinator dependent crops, as the name suggests, are sort of dependent on pollinators. So some flowers have female male parts in these crops, but they're self-incompatible. So things like almonds and apples. But they could also have separate flowers for male and female flowers or male female plants. Examples just almonds, apples, cucurbits. And we have the pictures of their floral structures here in the bottom left. Now the pollinator independent crops is what I'm interested in because most of our row crops are pollinator independent. They have perfect flowers and they have the ability to self-pollinate. So pollination via insects or other animals is not necessarily required to produce fruit and seed. And things like this include cotton, soybean, canola, peanut, strawberries. And then our wind pollinated species are grasses like corn, rice, sorghum, and others are pollinated by wind. So what bees are we talking about in pollinator independent crops or just in general? We can have managed versus unmanaged bees. Our managed bee side of things, mostly social species with some exceptions that we'll talk about here. Honeybees, everyone's familiar with honeybees. We mentioned, they're actually technically an invasive species, although don't tell beekeepers that. And they're not always the most efficient pollinators in certain crops, but they're the easiest to take around the country on trucks and move around to provide services for crops that need pollination services. We have bumblebees as well. They're also social, broad diet. They're used a lot in greenhouse crops in Europe, and they do really well there. I think we're picking up more speed in using these in the US. We actually have a couple hives for some watermelon studies at the NFREC in Quincy. And then our others that are actually native species or some non-native species that are solitary bees that are sort of managed are some alfalfa leafcutter bee, the alkali bee, and mason bees. If you've ever heard of the term orchard bees, those are a managed type of bee. And our management schemes that we have here, we're familiar with beehive boxes, honeybee hive boxes, but for our leaf cutters and orchard bees, people create like blocks of wood with pre-drilled holes, or just a box with sticks, hollow sticks of different sizes, just to get a diversity of species that will go and nest in those cavities. And then I think our only sort of managed ground nesting bee is the alkali bee. That's from the Pacific Northwest. So growers out there will actually set aside a portion of their land that's favorable, has a favorable soil type for this bee to sort of entice this bee to nest in that land. And they sort of have aggregation of nests. You can see this picture here, where you just have a bunch of nests of alkali bees, and this is for alfalfa seed production out in the Pacific Northwest. And then on our unmanaged side of things, these are going to be all our wild native species. And they have diverse natural history, resource requirements, as Rachel alluded to in the previous talk. Generalists, specialists, but mostly they're all solitary. And some have communal aggregations, semi-socials, and some sociality exists in our native species. And the majority of them are ground nesting. And I'm going to focus a little more on ground nesting because that's what we see a lot in cotton and row cropping systems. And sometimes they're more effective pollinators than honeybees. So are there relationships of bees and pollinator independent crops? Are there benefits to bees from these pollinator independent crops and the vice versa? Are there benefits from the bees to pollinator independent crops? So now one thing pollinator independent crops have in common is that they're all mass flowering. Think cotton, soybean, canola, peanut, corn. For example, soybean, you can produce 800 florets per plant and up to 500 florets per acre. So then look at the example of pictures on the bottom. So each one of those cotton bolls at one point in time was a cotton flower. So this could be potentially a tremendous amount of resources in the landscape for pollinators. And now our pollinators actually foraging on these crops. So this table here on the top right is a study out of Virginia Tech, a recent study. And they looked at honeybees foraging in Virginia agroecosystems. And they found that honeybees frequently visited row crop during bloom. And peanut was the most favorable, which I was surprised at in terms of land cover percentage, because peanut only produces a pollen. So honeybees are, in fact, going to peanut for pollen, but where they're getting their nectar from. So it's just sort of interesting. And then what is the nutritional value of these pollens and nectars of our row crops to bees? So now let's talk about bees and cotton. What bees, honeybees, or wild bees? So there's a lot of literature that was done, back in the 60s, and this review with the 31 studies indicate positive benefits from honeybees. That was done in Australia. As far as we in the US, honeybees don't really like cotton pollen. Cotton pollen is pretty large and interferes with their ability to pack pollen on their legs. So they avoid the pollen, but they do like the nectar. And not many were observed. Everything's getting cut off. Not many were observed in my studies where I did this work in South Texas. But Florida's a little different. I did see a lot of beekeepers place hives in cotton and peanut crops this year, which I thought was really interesting. And then our wild bees, we do have a lot of literature, pollination benefits, there's positive effects, no negative effects, but it's a little mixed. You either have a study that shows positive benefits or a study that doesn't. In some agroecosystems, we have a diverse community of bees in our row crops, and some we just don't know. For example, I don't know what our Florida situation looks like in our Florida row crops. But one thing we do have in common in row crops is that there seems to be one dominant genus in row crops, and that's Melisodes, which is in the longhorn bees. And Melisodes was observed in Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, Brazil, and there's a sister genus in Africa, an old world genus that is also found in African cotton. So this genus seems to be, but it is a generalist species, but it just happens to like cotton for some reason. This is just throw up some numbers for y'all out of a study I did during my PhD back in Texas or South Texas. So over 2 years, we trapped bees and we caught about 5,500 specimens, and leading to 33 species across 3 families and 13 genera. And 2 dominant genera we found were Melisodes, like I just mentioned, with 2 species, Melisodes tepaneca and Melisodes communis. And then Dialictis or Lasioglossum, which was our small sweat bees. The pictures aren't really to scale, but it's a little guy down there on the bottom left. They're really hard to identify, but we had a complex of about 12 morphospecies of Dialictis. And then I had a collaborator in Mississippi who was also looking at pollinators and cotton systems. So we sort of compared bee communities across Mississippi and Texas. And if you just look at the pie charts, they're quite similar in Mississippi and Texas. Melisodes was dominant in both regions. There's a little more diversity in Mississippi side of things. There are 32 species are spread across 4 bee families and 21 genera compared to 3 families and 13 for Texas. Do a little speed here. And this is really cool. So in terms of Melisodes, when I was in South Texas, I was working on fields that were 1,000 acres of cotton. And we were sampling for pests as well as bees, 500 meters into that cotton. And I was wondering, where are these bees nesting? And there's old literature suggesting from the 70s suggesting that the bees are nesting, in fact, in the cotton fields, which people don't necessarily always agree with. But this we found, I got a call last Thursday about bees swarming in our cotton trial, in somebody's cotton trial in NFREC. And it turns out it was an aggregation of Melisodes communis nests, which I thought was really cool because I've been trying to find Melisodes tepaneca nest in general, but it's a different species, but very similar in biology. And there's just not a lot known about their nesting structure, even though it's a relatively common bee found nationwide. And then we have a little cool one. I think Rachel would appreciate this. We also have a little a Tripiola species, so it's a parasite of this bee. So it'll go and lay its eggs in their nests, sort of I refer to one of those, what are they called? Cuckoo birds, where the birds lay eggs in other birds' nests. That bird takes care of it. Just kind of does the same thing. So there seems to be a really cool little community going on in our cotton field. I'm looking forward to digging one of these up after we harvest it tomorrow, apparently. All right, and now I'm going to try or excavate it and just get to see what it's actually doing. So can cotton benefit from pollination from bees? And I think I'm going to be going over time. Try to go through this quick. So, cotton is self-pollinating. So do we even see benefits from cotton? Cotton is really interesting. Flowering biology, it's a really cool plant in general. But flowers generally open for 8 to 11 hours, and anthesis occurs in the morning hours, and pollen is only viable for a couple hours. And the pollen is too large to be carried from plant to plant by wind, so we're going to need some insect vector to get cross-pollination. And when I was looking into this back in Texas, I was looking through the literature and found papers that, okay, cotton can benefit from pollination even though it was by hand. They saw this group out of UT Austin saw a 17% increase in cottonseed weight from hand-crossed flowers. So I thought, well, what happens if we take a bee commonly found in cotton and cage it on the plants? I'm not going to explain the design, but we just caged a bunch of bees on cotton plants for a period of 2 weeks. Why is everything cut off? But here's just the results from this. So flowers that we exposed to bees for that period of 2 weeks produce significantly heavier seed cotton weights on a per boll basis, leading up to about 32% increase on a per boll basis. And then when you average that across the whole plant, it's about a 12.8% increase across the whole plant, which is kind of significant given the fact that cotton's already self-pollinating, doesn't need pollination, but we still see this yield increase. And these bees are already in the system. So it's all about, well, how do we recruit more of them to get more benefits from them? So What about bees and soybean? We kind of see the same thing. It's another mass flowering, self-pollinating crop. We seem to have a diverse bee community. One study had 68 species of pollinators in a soybean system. And again, Melissodes dialectus is very common. And there are studies that show benefits, mostly positive. And the cases that do show positive effects, it's 60 to 20% increases in yield when exposed to bees. And bees are also foraging for nectar and pollen in soybeans. One study found about 40% of bees over 2 years were carrying soybean pollen. But soybean varies by variety as far as in terms of nectar production and pollen production. So it's going to be often interesting studies between interactions on soybean varieties and bee foraging. So why does this all matter? Well, we have a lot of row crops planted in the US. And if you look at sort of what we plant in Florida compared to other places in the country, like Iowa, where it's mainly corn, soybean, we're a little more diverse in Florida, just on the row crop side of things, but we're really diverse when we include vegetables, pastures, forages, winter covers, and all of that. For row crop wise, we got soybean, corn, cotton, and peanut. So it could be potentially a tremendous amount of floral resources to support wild bees, as well as beneficial insects, especially when we're talking about pastures and winter covers. But we need a lot more research done, at least on the terms on the pollinator side of things, life histories of dominant visitors, and how do we bolster these populations to get these added benefits, whether it's pest control or pollination benefits. Oh, and then also the nutritional content of floral nectar and pollen for these bees. Are they eating it? Can they sustain a lot of these wild bee species? So I don't think I'm going to have time for questions, but feel free to call whatever. We can talk about bees and cotton or crops.